We have now 17 and a half minutes. So I don't want to waste any time, but I want to first of all say thank you. To be back again in Warsaw is very welcome, and it's very heartening to see so many people attending a conference, and especially after lunch. So I need you to try and stay awake, at least for a while. I'm going to talk about sexting, about online production of images, and I also want to talk a little bit about pornography, but we haven't got a lot of time, and I'm going to use some of our research findings for this. Right. It's not needed. That work? No. Would it move on if I just tap the screen? Yes. I'll do that. Yes. I'll do that. Right. Not a problem. Right. Technological solutions. I'm from Edinburgh. This is kind of our picture of our city. This is to try and entice you to come visit. I'm going to start by simply looking at the framework that was developed for the EU Kids Online project, which, if you haven't looked at their website, is worth looking at. And it actually looks at children in terms of both the content that they might be exposed to, the contact that they might have with people, and also their conduct. So where the child is an actor. And it breaks that down across a whole lot of potentially problematic areas. And clearly the focus that I want to look at is sexual. And that includes then content, for example, being exposed to pornographic content, as well as conduct, which might mean sexual harassment and also sexting. We've heard all morning about the kinds of social media that most of us engage with, at least in part. And I'm going to talk about this because social media becomes an important vehicle for some of these activities. I think it's important. I took this, it's a rather long quote on adolescence and pornography, because I was asked to talk about pornography itself. And this, I think, is a very, very good review of the last 20 years of research on the impact of pornography on young people. And in the main, we know that for adolescents who use pornography more frequently, that they're likely to be male, they're likely to have be at a more advanced pubertal stage, so they're going to be a little bit older. They're likely also to be sensation seekers, so this is associated with higher levels of pornography use, and they are more likely to have weak or troubled family relationships. And we know that pornography use is also associated then with more permissive sexual attitudes and tends to be linked with stronger gender stereotyped sexual beliefs. So while overall the research is not conclusive, it is more conclusive when we start to look at high levels of pornography use. So there will be many people who are exposed to pornography, either because they seek it out, which is likely with older adults, or because they accidentally stumble across it. It is associated more with male gender, although that may change. For the majority of young people, it does not seem to have any negative impact, but for some, it does. And this is going to be maybe a larger context when we think about some of the sexual risk-taking type behaviors that we see with young people. I'm going to talk about two different kinds of sexting. And I'm going to pick up on some of the research that came from the Crimes Against Children Research Unit. But I wanted to just set the scene by thinking about the potential misuse of these images. And I've just given a brief overview there of offences involving sexual images of children. And the diagonal that goes across here relates to self-taken images, images that are produced by young people themselves. And I'm going to hold on to the idea that this may be an important development and an unwelcome development. There is a lot of research to suggest that self-produced images, engagement with sexual content that is self-produced, can be associated with a whole variety of problematic experiences, including elevated levels of violence within young relationships as well. So there's a lot of negative press around self-produced images, around sexting. And in fact, I noticed that one of the papers that was cited earlier was by Doring, and I think there is a backlash to this, where is the suggestion that are we simply giving a negative slant? And are we ignoring the fact that for many young people, sexual engagement online, sexual exploration online, sexual self-representation online may be a lot less dangerous than some of the sexual behavior that may have been engaged with otherwise. And I think it is important that we just hold out that there are opposing views here. So when we talk about sexting, and I don't know whether you will have seen them, I'm going to make some reference to some of the terminology guidelines. But this was, my interest in this was in part because of an EU-funded project that we had. I've put the link to it there if you want to chase up any of the materials. What was important for us in this was the output to the project, which include, I'm going to talk about some of the data, interviews with young people who had been engaging in self-produced image taking, but also we analysed data from the Interpol database of identified children. But what we also were interested in was to help produce guidelines that may inform practitioners on how these cases might best be managed. And in particular, this related to parents and to teachers. We've had some ESRC funding, UK funding, that followed up on this, that really built on some of those guidelines. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those. Okay, so the terminology guidelines were developed, they came out in 2016. It was a consensus approach to the terms that we use across this whole area, and I think they're worth looking at. When they talk about sexting, they give if you like, a big array of, I sometimes wonder where the words come from in terms of sexting and sextortion, which is another one, but a whole array of different ways that this has been both defined and also the way it's been measured. So it's a very confusing area, certainly in terms of things like prevalence. But we can see that sexting very often is seen as the exchange of self-produced sexual images, the exchange of content could be across quite diverse contexts, and many of them are probably benign. They're in what we might call romantic or sexual relationships between young people. But they also point out that, in fact, there are also versions of what you might call unwanted sharing of images, where the images are produced where the other person who is actually pressurizing somebody to send images has an aggressive or an unwanted context to it. And I want us to consider both sides of this, because for practitioners, for teachers, for people working with young people, I think this is something that we need to understand. So, I'm going to refer back to Wallach and Finkelhor's earlier terminology, this typology rather, of sexting. And they looked at police-identified cases where the images that had been exchanged met the criteria within the US, I use their terminology, for child pornography. So they crossed that benchmark in terms of what constituted the images themselves. I'm just looking at time. They divided their cases into aggravated and experimental cases. And the experimental ones were the ones that were produced in a romantic context or maybe were acts of attention seeking. And the aggressive ones was where there were criminal or abusive behavior. And the reason that I've been so interested in this, because my area has largely been in the context of what we would have called child pornography or child abuse images, is that the data from the US suggested by around 2012, the majority of the images that were seized by people associated with online grooming behavior were produced by young people themselves in the context of these coercive relationships. And we have other data from the NICMEC database that would support this. Right, down to 7 minutes. We know that there are lots of issues that are associated with sexting. Relational anxiety is one, where people are likely to feel more likely to send sexual images of themselves, if they feel anxious about themselves, if they feel under pressure, if they feel that they have to prove themselves or show themselves within that relationship. We also know that there are issues around sexting and sexual agency. We know that the whole area, issues looking at sexual agency, shows that there are tensions here between the notion of feminine identity and the notion of agency and the right to be sexually experimenting. And then at the same time, this almost stereotypic idea of control within a relationship. So there are real tensions here around self-produced images. I'm going to talk to our first study, which was our Interpol database study, and we looked at 687 claimed cases in the UK. These were children who were identified, and we looked at who had actually produced these images. So these are the total number of claimed cases in the UK, in the database of claimed cases. We found that the gender of the children within those 687 cases, two-thirds were female, so a predominantly female sample. Although in 2013 there were more boys. We know that of those children, the majority of them were white. And who produced the images? And this is where the surprise came from us. 44% were self-taken images. So these are images that met the criteria for being illegal. So 44% were self-taken. But of those, the largest number, so 33% of the total, were taken in the context of a coercive relationship. Online grooming, where somebody has actually persuaded them to take the images. And family members were the next largest group. And our coercive images largely were of teenagers, of adolescents. It was the younger children whose images were taken by family members. When we talked to children about why they sent sex, they gave lots and lots of different reasons. Maintaining a long-distance relationship, feeling pressured, feeling threatened, seeking excitement, developing intimacy, wanting to flirt, having fun. Some of these were gender-determined. Having fun was a much more a gendered one. Exploring sexuality. That was particularly the case for young people who were questioning their sexuality or who were LGBT youth. Gaining recognition, trying to please or impress. The majority of these young people, in fact, came to no harm. There were no negative consequences for them outside of the ongoing anxiety about who had the images and whether or not they may be distributed. In a proportion of the cases that we interviewed children, they had been distributed, and a section of these children had also produced the images in the context of a grooming relationship. We then moved on to, we had developed some materials for people, particularly for parents and teachers, in terms of what happens when things go wrong. We had a consensus-seeking study. We had young people within a Delphi study who were acting as experts. And we wanted to identify the needs of young people when, in fact, a sexting scenario has gone wrong and the images have been distributed. And out of this, we've developed guidelines for good practice that link very closely in the UK with the guidelines that have been published by the police, but also the guidelines that have been published with the aid of the Southwest Grid for Learning by for teachers themselves. So I'm not going to have time to go through all of these. Our results, though, were interesting. We tend to talk about the importance of education and making sure that children understand the risks that they are taking. In the main, all of these children were well educated, they knew the risks that they were taking, and they took them anyway. And I think that is something that is important for us to understand. They could identify when, in fact, the images had been shared. They could identify that people were talking about them. They could identify what a boyfriend or partner may say. They also looked, for example, at how teachers and other professionals around them might deal with the fact that these images have been taken. They felt it was important that the young person wasn't excluded from school, that they didn't isolate themselves, that they weren't treated any differently. They felt it was important that they knew what was happening. In the UK, while we have moved away from necessarily criminalising the activity, these young people had still committed a crime. They were still reported in the main to the police. There were still procedures that took place around them, including the seizure, for example, of their digital devices. What was important to them was that we understood the context, that they were kept informed, that they were not worked around, but actually worked with. And I think I've got 37 seconds left. Being informed about the procedures and being listened to seem to be central in this. Right? Move that one on. Okay. And in terms of the police, teachers, speaking with the people involved, not drawing attention to the individual. And for the police, reassuring that the matter will be dealt with safely and appropriately. Right, nearly done. We developed some materials. I've finished. The project worked with the National Crime Agency as one of our partners. We had other partners in Sweden and in Germany. The materials were developed with a view not to frighten, not to leave people feeling that there was nothing to do and that the world had fallen apart around them. They were about, there are 4 short, maybe more than that, films, and they are very much focused on what we can do if something goes wrong, the proactive steps that we can take. One final message in relation to this is that we can do something when things go wrong. We can do lots of things before they go wrong in terms of talking to our children. Our recent research, and it links very much with the research from the National Centre, would suggest that some of the messages that we've been giving to young people with very good intentions in mind, that these images are widely distributed, that everybody is looking at them, that will never go away, in fact, are not accurate. The data from the Crimes Against Children Research Unit had suggested that these self-produced images, in the main, are not widely distributed. And our data from the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children would suggest something similarly. That is not to say that we shouldn't educate. That is not to say that we shouldn't encourage people to safely engage with the internet and be careful about what they actually both produce and share. But I think we reduce the likelihood of children seeking help if, in fact, the consequences of that are so frightening for them. I think I went 60 seconds over time.